one of the lessons that we had learned was that open source software was going to be how people would consume infrastructure, at least at some base level. We weren't sure exactly what the business model was going to be, but we could see it was going to be important. For example, at Metalogic in Finland, we'd been introduced to Martin Mikos at MySQL, and he'd said, yeah, sure, I'd be very happy to distribute your app server with my database, but you'll need to make at least some of it open source. And we weren't sure what that would mean.
Hello and welcome to Committing to Cloud Native, the podcast where we talk about the interface between open source and cloud native. We're super excited about our guest today. Can't wait to introduce him. Our panelists today are Justin Dorfman and Tzury Yochay, and they're going to have an awesome conversation. I really enjoyed listening to it, and I really hope you enjoy this conversation.
How are you doing today, Alexis?
Very well, thank you. Nice to be here.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Alexis, for coming on. We're very excited. At the very early days of thinking, considering, and planning how to make Curiefense as a public open source project, we have a really insightful and effective conversation. And some of those great ideas, I hope we can elaborate today and repeat them to the benefit of our audience. So, Alexis, would you mind sharing with us your own professional history before you came about co-founding and running Weaveworks?
I'll try. I mean, I've been in the tech industry about 20 years. Before that, I was in financial services. My first job after leaving university was at Goldman Sachs, where I was a derivatives trader for a while. And I had a background in mathematics and computation and things like this, and an interest in technology. So when I was working in the city, became very interested in how technology was affecting how people made money and did their business. And we could see that, increasingly things were getting automated, not just in the single user Excel decision support sense, but just across the whole firm. And decided that it would be fun to sort of get into technology full time. So I left and started a company with a friend, which became Metalogic, which was an early stage technology venture for me in Europe, building what we would now call a front office app server, I guess, in Java. And we were one of the first companies that really made an effort to kind of cater to the ordinary developer who didn't want to learn about enterprise APIs and enterprise this and enterprise that, but just write things as if they'd just done a university course. Unfortunately, that was way early, and there were other fairly crazy things about the company that meant that we didn't succeed. But after we packed it in, I decided to do another company building on the lessons learned. And one of the lessons that we had learned was that open source software was going to be how people would consume infrastructure, at least at some base level. We weren't sure exactly what the business model was going to be, but we could see it was going to be important. For example, at Metalogic in Finland, we'd been introduced to Martin Mikos at MySQL, and he'd said, yeah, sure, I'd be very happy to distribute your app server with my database, but you'll need to make at least some of it open source. And we weren't sure what that would mean. So I decided to learn about open source, and in sequence met up with a lot of people some of whom are still very active in the industry, like James Strachan, who's now, I think, at CloudBees doing Jenkins X. He was doing ActiveMQ at the time. Ross Mason, who went on to do MuleSoft, then SymphonySoft, and Rod Johnson, who did SpringSource, which was Interface 21 at the time, and many other similar people, and realized that, there was a way to build a company here, but making money was something that we were going to have to figure out. And we could all see Red Hat and MySQL pioneering, but we weren't sure where that would go either. So I started various companies to try and tackle the problem of open source support in a world of lots of components that enterprises wanted to consume. And that settled down into building an open source stack for finance, because that was my background. And I got together with a bunch of finance guys, and we did a company called Cohesive, which became Cohesive FT because it was financial technology. And Cohesive, we soon realized that the way that source software was going to be used wasn't just open source, but also through cloud and virtualization. So we built a tool called Elasticsearch, and then we built a bunch of cloud tools, which became somewhat popular. But while we were doing that, I hadn't lost my interest in open source, and was working with JP Morgan as part of my project at Cohesive. And they had launched a new initiative called AMQP, which was supposed to be like HTTP or TCP for networking in the web, but aimed at integration and messaging like MQ from IBM and Tibco Rendezvous, which was 30 or 40% of the typical financial services IT budget. And so they wanted to have a protocol like HTTP that anyone could implement using different implementations, just like we have many web browsers and web servers today. And they all talk to each other despite being made by different people because the protocol makes them work. So we decided to make a tool called RabbitMQ, which would implement AMQP and then could do integration and be part of the open source stack in finance. But actually, I soon realized that would be, while a fun thing to do, it would be more relevant to the industry if we took this product, which is open source, and provided it as a tool to Silicon Valley companies building websites, people like Heroku, Engineer, and others. I mean, this is at the time when GitHub, Twilio, everyone was getting started with these big products. And so we've sort of pivoted our attention towards those companies. And instead of building RabbitMQ with, a C# client or a C+ client so that some finance person could try and put it into their execution engine and then not pay us any money because it was open source. Instead, we focused on, solving problems for the cloud generation of apps represented by these Silicon Valley companies. And as a result of this, RabbitMQ found a niche, and the niche was one it could grow from and became very successful. So we ended up with the company, Rabbit Technologies, which I also started alongside Cohesive, getting acquired by VMware. And from there, I went on to Pivotal, where I ran Spring and vFabric. I was responsible for the generation of Spring Boot and Spring Cloud, speaking as a product owner rather than as a techie, because I'm not a developer. And then after that, I decided to leave and do Weaveworks because I could see that the application developer and the cloud and open source were going to continue to be the thing which was driving the market. And now today, we've seen this explosion of tools around Docker and Kubernetes, a whole ecosystem of hundreds of new tools, which is exactly what we hoped would happen. And I think that we're in a new world where finally we can see the potential for a second generation of technology like the internet in the 90s, but for applications. And those applications will run anywhere connected by things like 5G networks. So a very exciting time to be in the industry.
Indeed. You just mentioned so many great tools that all of us are familiar with, many of us been using or still using, and perhaps we can just hang on those and talk about that exciting era. You mentioned GitHub started, Engineer, Heroku, and so on. I do want to ask you though, Alexis, before we moving forward to Weaveworks and talking about cloud native, Kubernetes, and so on, I do want to hang on this open source topic for a second. So you said you made through, in Finland, was it, you made through this MySQL guru creator, right? And he said, I'll be happy to distribute your software, but you have to make at least some of it open source.
He said that. That was Martin. Yeah, Martin's view was we can partner, but there needs to be an open source overlap.
So from your experience over the years, are people preferring open source as a sort of insurance policy to get more confidence with the software they're using, or they're actually preferring the open source so they can actively contribute and get involved in the development and patch and so on?
So I think the answer to this question changes over time. I mean, today, I think people prefer open source because almost all the best infrastructure software is open source. And as a result of this, it has widespread support in the industry, which means that you can choose multiple vendors to get you help. I mean, not always, but mostly. And that means that you get a fair price and you get to compare and make good decisions. And we're also seeing a new generation of open source coming through where the developers at big end user firms who are not traditional software vendors, but companies like Uber or Lyft or SoundCloud or Spotify, Dot,
Netflix and so on.
All of those folks, the Netflixes of the world, are themselves not only consuming but producing open source. And so that's become part of the understanding about how infrastructure software is done today. It's good not only because everybody's building it on the vendor side of the fence, but also because everybody's building it on the end user side of the fence. But originally, I would say that wasn't the primary reason why people would use it. And I think that the main reason that I saw that really drove the change to what we see now is when you're trying out software for the first time, it's a lot easier if you don't have to talk to salespeople or pay for things or download a limited period trial edition or worry about the licensing or really any of that stuff, because that's just getting in the way. And so I would say open source coincides with two phenomena that we've seen that are very important. One is self-service and the other is agile. Now, I know that agile today is a little bit of a dirty word, and we talk about other ways of, dynamic IT and DevOps and so on. But fundamentally, moving to a more iterative, faster moving way of planning and executing with tight decision loops, or OODA loops, as some people call them, versus the old way of doing technology in the 90s, where we would set the budget and then spend 2 years spending it. And then after 2 years, we'd figure out if we'd got the project right or wrong, which was often wrong. Whereas with the iterative method, you're constantly adjusting your plan like a yacht in a race. And then self-service, coincides with the web. It's not an accident that Amazon.com was successful. You can go to something that you don't even need to get out of your chair. You can look at a screen, which is already in front of you. Maybe you're at work and you can do this while you're supposedly working. You can spend hours and hours browsing books, and then you can buy one. It gets sent to you and you don't even have to get out of your seat to even get it sent to you. Maybe somebody has to collect it from the front door if you've got a doorbell. And this self-service is just about convenience. And convenience is very important for progress, because every time you put something in somebody's way that prevents them and gives them a chance to say no to something, then they might not do it and you lose users. But you can build a big business if you make things convenient. So at Netflix, they talk about the moment of truth, or something that it's, or the moment of decision. This idea that before a person watches Netflix, they have an opportunity to decide to do something else, like, I don't know, go for a walk or make a meal or watch television or play with their dog or talk to their family. No, say Netflix, you shouldn't do any of those things. You should, in the moment of truth, you should have this decision to use Netflix, because it will always work. It's always convenient. It always comes on when something you want to see, which, if you think about it, is a little sinister, but they really put their finger on this idea that people want to make decisions in a convenient way. And self-service is really critical to how users, as we call them, how people want to do things. And if you think about software developers as people, which we do now, luckily, then it's really easy to see that people want to have convenience in their work and tools that are familiar. Philosophers in the early part of the last century wrote made careers writing books about the relationship between people, work, and tools, and how it needs to be authentic. And I think that the self-service, iterative way of working in teams that open source lends itself to, and SaaS as well, is really the right way to work in technology. Otherwise, it becomes alienating.
So you mentioned open source company. Some would think this is a contradiction within the same sentence. Open source means nonprofit, but the core idea is free. And our company purpose is to earn revenues to shareholders. So I'm assuming that building a company, an organization on top of an open source technology, those multi-layers of, I would say, operations that you're running has to be thought. You need to think about each and every aspect of the operation and what should goes into the open source, at which point or which parts of your solution should be allocated on the premium paid side and so on. Would you mind share with us your thoughts about this question?
So there's many different answers to this question over time, again, just as with the other question. And I think today it's a little different from how it was 5 or 10 years ago. But an open source company is a company that primarily works with or produces open source tools in order to engage with customers who are users first, because they have a free experience as well as potentially a paid experience. And, we can see a lot of open source companies in the world today. Confluent is a great example. They primarily work on Kafka, which is an open source product, but they also make money by selling an enterprise edition. Some years ago, you could have argued that a company like ThoughtWorks was an open source company because they often recommended open source tools in their consulting. I'm not sure if that's still true, but I've also seen other consulting firms that are primarily open source focused. But they would say that this is for the benefit of the user, or the user doesn't have lock-in or has choice. But often the real reason was developers just wanted to use those tools and work with them. But from a software product side, it's very clear that it's more of a company like Confluent. Whether the product is some kind of support services or enterprise product or SaaS, fundamentally, you're building a capability where the end user starts their journey through an open source experience, almost certainly, with an open source tool, be it Kafka or Kubernetes or Weaveworks. We've been doing a lot of business around Flux as well as Kubernetes and Flagger, which provide people with GitOps capability. Other companies are building a business around other things in the CNCF. I think here, Tzury, you're building a business around Curiefense, which is in security. So you'd be an open source company in that sense. The question then becomes, what is open? And for some companies, the answer has been everything's been open because we sell a complementary product. Here's a good example of that isn't even open source, but similar. Norton Antivirus. Do you remember you'd buy your laptop and it would have Windows on it? And for some reason, it would also have Norton Antivirus on it. And it was really difficult to uninstall it. Then this thing would sit there and it would tell you very volubly and constantly and gregariously, you've got a virus or you haven't got a virus. And if you're a normal person, this would be maddening. Anyway, you soon figure out if you've got any sort of tech sense at all that you need to tell this thing to keep updating itself. Otherwise, it's going to get out of date and think that everything is evil on your computer and pass you till the end of time. So what they've done there is they've given you a free product, which contains free intellectual property, which is the virus list, okay, and the patterns they're looking for. And then they forced you to upgrade to a commercial subscription to get that thing updated. Otherwise, this thing turns into hassleware. So that is an open source business model par excellence. I think users have pushed back on that now, thank goodness.
Download.com and CNET those days. Yeah.
Oh my
the good old days of
the toolbars. Oh, man, don't mention.
AOL and BISC and everything.
Yep.
Anyway, today, my recommendation would be that, you really need to think that if you want to build a business around something open source, number one rule, your open source project has to be successful. You can't build a business around an open source project that nobody uses. You can't make money if, everybody says, well, I'd love to use your open source project, but I'm actually using Kubernetes. This is ultimately why D2IQ changed from Mesosphere to D2IQ and from Mesos to Kubernetes, because at some point they realized there just aren't enough Mesos users who want to go commercial anymore. And they're all going to Kubernetes. So the other thing that's very important is a consequence, a corollary of being successful is you have to be seen to be successful, which means that you need to be clear leader in your space. Now, some spaces are very big and have many leaders. Databases is a really good example. Within the world of databases, you have categories, and in each one you have typically 2 or 3 or 4 good open source projects. Some are older, some are newer, some have different features. I think this is a very healthy situation. And then you have another 200 that generally don't get used. That might be special purpose or a labor of love for somebody working alone or something that, was somebody's fun project for a few years and then ran out of gas. We saw this with web frameworks in Java in 2000s. There was a time when there were 30 or 40 of these. And then mobile frameworks, 2010 onwards. Now we just have React and Angular and a couple of other things. So you need to be a leader for your project to be successful, and people need to be aware that you're the leader. And for that to be true, you really need to be pretty fully featured. Because trust me, if there's more than one company or team or group or whoever it is, whether it's, a commercial project or if it's a pure community play, really important to remember projects do compete for attention and users can become contributors and they support the project over time. And all of that is a competition in some sense. It can be a friendly competition, but it's still a competition. And for that to go well, it really doesn't help if you choose to remove a critical feature from your project. Okay. If you do, and you have enough open source users who want that feature, then you have to choose between one of 3 things. 1, you put it in, or your community puts it in. 2, you tell people to use something else with your project. So, for example, Kubernetes doesn't have a GUI because there are plenty of other GUIs that you can use, and some of them are open source. There are also commercial GUIs, of course. But if nobody had a Kubernetes GUI, I'm sure that Kubernetes would have built one inside the project. And then the third option is just to tell your users to go and themselves. Which, trust me, is a really bad idea if you're trying to build a business. Okay. Now, if you're not trying to build a business, maybe it doesn't matter. There might be all kinds of reasons why the users are happy with the limited feature set. But if there's a critical feature that users want, you shouldn't hold it back. And that's really important when you look at closely governed open source projects with a single company around them, which deliberately hold back features. They can get into trouble if they end up in competition with that community.
So if I get it right, the foundation of a successful open source company is the open source layer, the open source core, the open source community, the product, feature set, support, and so on.
Correct. So then you should provide the features that people need right now if you can. And obviously everyone knows that engineering the resources are not infinite, and nobody expects you to have all the features that they could possibly imagine. And you should always be prepared to say no. A really good way to do that is to have some kind of steering committee or project management group in your open source, which can say yes or no to features and produce roadmaps and stuff.
Yeah. So for this part to be successful, it has to do with, you mentioned being a leader. So to be a leader, you need to have those who follows you, right? Those who follow you, meaning you got to build a community. And you
got to build a community, and you also have to have competitors.
Alexis, you have been building several communities over the years. I believe you were also a chair at the CNCF for a few years, right? Could you share with us a few great insights of how to build successful community around a tech product?
Well, this is obviously one of the kind of $1 million questions, and you can build a great community and still not make money. So be careful what you do with this advice. So the secret of a good community is trust and communication. And then I think thirdly, incentives. So, you can establish trust by, for example, always responding to users. When I did RabbitMQ, we had a rule. Anyone who asks a question on the mailing list gets answered within 48 hours of business time. And that created the impression that we were a very responsive community. The communication is really important. You can't be a leader if you're not actually telling people what's going on. They can't trust you either. So you need to have folks writing about the project, going to conferences, talking about use cases. When you have end users who are successful, you need to encourage them to talk about that. It really helps if you're a natural sort of networking person or a kind of party person is also a good person to have. I think a great example of this done right is Alice's job with OpenFAS. Alex is kind of tirelessly awake, nonstop, promoting an OpenFAS, but putting people in touch with each other and helping people along. And then I think a third factor is incentives, and this is where you get scale because you really can't do everything. Not everyone can be Alex Ellis. You need to find a way to encourage contributors to take ownership so then you can have an ecosystem. And with Rabbit, we copied Mule, which basically had a load of integration plugins. So we said, we'll manage the core, which will allow us to have a fairly small engineering team before we can start trying to worry about commercialization. And then we'll have an ecosystem of adapters, plugins, and about 250 in the end, which is quite a lot.
How did that go in terms of relying on the community to come up with those plugins?
We have to seed it yourself. So you need to go out and be prepared to go and find people to build the first ones, and then you create momentum. So that was something we did with the CNCF. That we knew that the secret was having a CNCF community that was out of control, and that would force everybody to jump on board because there would be a sense of unstoppable momentum. And that was much more important than any other kind of marketing at the beginning anyway. So we had this strategy of attaching successful projects to the CNCF, which meant that we had to go and find those projects and convince them that if they're looking for a foundation, the CNCF was a good choice, or that a foundation would make sense for their particular project, which it didn't in every case. And that led us to things like Kubernetes and Prometheus and Envoy and so on, which meant that by the time you get to 7 or 8 of these, people realize there's something special happening here. And then you can move into a different phase of marketing in a different way. But, how do you get good communication, good contribution? You go out, find contributors. They need to be outside your team. You ideally look for tribal leaders, people who are very well known in the Ruby community or whatever. Sometimes you can have several people. One person does the coding. One person does the evangelism. Another strategy is to tie yourself to platforms so that your project is being used alongside another widely used thing. That gives you a platform for success. Those are all strategies for building community.
Thank you, because that's what I'm currently doing with Curiefense. So this is really great advice. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Another thing that's really important is, if you're thinking of commercialization, is thinking about users on a journey. And for that, you need documentation and good examples of success stories and integrations, and then help them with things like analytics to start to understand how the project is going. And once you have that, you'll have enterprise serious users coming along And you won't just have small scale use or people with no money, but also people who actually have real business problems that need solving around operations and scale and security and governance, automation, BI, AI, everything. All of those things start to become more and more of a pain point as you grow. And as you grow, you're obviously generating revenue in your business. So then you have a way of paying for features from the vendor. And that's where, if you want to build an open source business, you come back and you say, okay, we are selling you capability that can help you to scale up. So that could be services or it could be enterprise products.
Do you mind sharing with us, elaborating a little more about Weaveworks, the products, the solutions?
So Weaveworks, in the light of this conversation, can be seen very simply, actually. We're fundamentally offering a productivity solution for free to developers in Kubernetes. Because in Flux and GitOps, we're making it super easy to deploy applications, undeploy applications, update them, scale them, patch them, and manage them on Kubernetes clusters. In fact, we're doing that for whole stacks. So we can, through configuration, which is how GitOps works, configuration lives in Git. The more you can describe, the more you can automate and control. So we enable you through agents to apply your configuration to running systems and automatically verify that everything is converged to the correct state, and then fire alerts if it hasn't, which means that you can run thousands and thousands of stacks, even if they're different, with just one person, because the operations are automated if you want. And that means that you can do things like, if you're a telco, you can have 5G in all of 40,000 telco towers around the country without having engineers visit them to fix things when they go wrong, which is awesome, really. And you can imagine many other high-scale use cases, I'm sure, like cars and drones and IoT, trains, cloud, etc. So we are offering a productivity solution because we're making it so that developers can very quickly recycle applications and clusters and stacks, any kind, wherever they like. But then by making people productive, our expectation is that people will then do more. So then we're selling commercially things that protect them if they do more. So security, governance, compliance, policy that protect you in a world where all your teams are using the same high productivity tool.
Yeah, you mentioned GitOps. Interesting enough, I'm not sure if you're aware of, but within Curiefense, the entire configuration engine is simply a Git repository. Right. So we were, back in the day, over a year and a half ago, we were thinking that would be probably the best solution. I'm not sure if GitOps was a term used at the time, but that was a natural choice from our perspective, intuitive choice to say, okay, let's use Git. So each branch will represent a different platform, QA, production, pre-prod, and so on. And every change that you make within your configuration, every rule that you change basically become a commit that you can roll. So then I found out about GitOps, which is a thing and a methodology and a way of life. And I was so excited to see how people coming from different directions, different angles are actually ending up in pretty much same principles, same concepts. So you mentioned the community, you mentioned the principles, I believe the foundation of transparency, communication, leadership. We skip over probably CNCF, the role of CNCF nowadays, the way you see it within running and moving forward, cloud native. So what is, in your opinion, the role of CNCF within the cloud native movement and the cloud native open source? As a company, if somebody now is thinking of, they have this idea of open source project.
What does it mean for us, you mean? For Weaveworks, we want as many companies as possible to have the simplest possible time using Kubernetes and cloud native. And therefore, we want everybody to be using, ideally, a very simple, common set of very popular tools. That is why we put our GitOps application CD tool, Flux, and our progressive delivery tool, Flagger, for example, into the CNCF. So we can co-invest in them with Amazon and Microsoft and Alibaba, for example, who are all using these things in production, and drive it forward as a common piece of infrastructure across the whole industry. And then enterprises, big companies like HSBC or Apple or Fidelity, big organizations that are using these open source tools can say, I'm doing continuous deployment or I'm doing progressive delivery. Let me use these tools to do that And I'm also doing GitOps, which means I can be secure and automated. Great.
By the way, who coined this GitOps term?
Me.
Yeah, I want to know. Oh, you
That
did?
was you.
It was
All
me.
right.
How awesome is it when like Kelsey Hightower talks about it on stage? I mean, that's pretty awesome.
I'm a very big fan of Kelsey and all of his work. He's the first person to really home in on how to explain GitOps in a really simple way to developers, which, we come from an operations perspective building a SaaS, and Kelsey wanted to really think it through. And he understood that it wasn't actually about Git as much as it was about ops. And this idea that you have this reconciliation loop that automatically fixes your stack for you every time it goes wrong, which means that you can do deployment and updates and patches and rollbacks all automatically. It's awesome. So anyway, going back to what's in the CNCF for us, being in a foundation is making a commitment to a community in return for hopefully building your commercial product out of standard tools. And by standard, I don't mean like ISO standards, but just tools that everybody recognizes that are used by lots of people. They don't even have to be individual leaders. They could be one of 3 or 4 commonly used tools. But when you talk to a customer, they don't say, go away because we're using Oracle. They say, please come in and talk to us because we're using the same tools that you've built your business from. Now, if you're a software company, that's a really good thing. Because think about back to the 90s when, it was like, oh, piss off, you're not Microsoft or you're not Oracle or you're not Sun. It's harder to make yourself stand out. But if you're in the open source world, the foundation creates a platform where not only big companies can succeed, but also small companies.
So how long do you think it will take Kubernetes, not to mention Istio, to be really simple to use? Like really simple.
Well, there is such a thing as fundamental complexity, right? Like Chaitin's rule or whatever, Kolmogorov complexity, I guess. What is the smallest number of bits that you could write Kubernetes in? And the answer is obviously 10, but, or 10 characters, that is. What can I say? I mean, Kubernetes is fundamentally a bit complicated because fundamentally it's quite richly featured. If you don't use all of Kubernetes, you can have a simpler experience. And there are tools like K3S. And trust me, I know a lot of people who've thought about writing their own simpler Kubernetes, but you're taking something out in order to be simpler. So that's the first thing. I think the root to simplicity is not, removing cyclotomic complexity. The code's going to stay, but we can simplify in other ways. For me, as an end user, Android is simple because I have a phone in front of me and I can turn it on and off and I can install applications and make phone calls. And if there's no fluff in the bottom, I can even charge it. So that's good. I don't need to care about Android version, particularly, or a lot of other things about Android. So in that sense, to me as a user, it is simple. So I'm experiencing the joys of platforms and embedded software now. And I believe that for Kubernetes, people will still think in terms of applications, but clusters will be part of the infrastructure you start the application with, like an app server on demand. So you'll go to the cloud and you'll say, give me my cluster and my stack. You'll say, I want to do machine learning. Okay, here's a cluster with machine learning stuff on it already. Off you go straight away and you'll be instantly productive. Or if I'm an independent software vendor, like, say I'm selling a business application, I will bundle that as a set of containers and maybe Kubernetes clusters so that somebody can run it wherever they want to without the whole installation rigmarole that we used to have in the enterprise. So all of that is good. So everyone operates much more like a kind of enterprise app store. And so all of that will mean that things for most users seem simple, even though there will still be some DevOps people and some platform operations engineers and some Linux people and some other people who are still concerned about how Kubernetes works and what the architecture should be for version 3. But the rest of the world is not going to care about that. Just like, I'm quite certain that you can spend hours of your life arguing with Linus Torvalds about things on the Linux lists on the days when he's allowed there. But, for the rest of us, it's not relevant. The world is simple enough that we can use Linux through other tools.
One more thing is I'd like to discuss before I'm running out of time is the new buyers. I would say the decision makers, the tech stack choice nowadays seems to be made by different audience than it used to be. So do you think this is one of the reasons for the open source and cloud native and the great moment that we're experiencing right now? Those, technologies are growing that rapidly, or is it the vice versa? Enabling
I think the industry is cyclical. Most industries are cyclical. You have a period of creation, expansion, and then a period of destruction and collapse, which precedes a new era of construction. And that's often in business associated with things like M&A, consolidation, growth. The internet in the 90s, I think, is the best analogy for today's era. And for a while, everybody was building the same stuff on the same tools. And then you get to the end of the 90s, around 2000, and you have the Java App Server wars. And it's a more destructive time. But from a business point of view, the market is still growing. And then you kind of get to about, 2006 or 7, and they're starting to consolidate, and people are starting to move on to a new tool set because they've realized that you can power big internet sites like Facebook on PHP. And suddenly the world is different. And people are thinking about the rich client and the mobile apps much more. So right now, I think we're in a period of expansion and creation. It's I guess a Cambrian explosion would be another analogy people like to use. A lot of strange new tools and hopeful monsters. And then I think that we'll soon see a period when, some of the land mammals emerge and not so many creatures are around, maybe a handful. And then there'll be in each category 2 or 3 good tools that everyone uses. The real winners out of this will be the people who build businesses out of it. Well, okay, no, that's not true. The end users will win because they'll have a chance to really drive the industry. The developers will win because they'll get to work on some fun stuff. But if you're building a business, it's a really good chance to find areas where you can solve problems that generate revenue, whether it's cloud operations or, governance or something else around the life cycle.
But help me understand something, and Alexis, and I'm not that I'm anti or God forbid, I'm part of this, right? I'm working on this project, open source and cloud native and all of that. However, to me, it still seems like something that I'm still not getting is the fact is that we talk about infrastructure as code. We talk about automation, talking about continuous integration and continuous deployment and GitOps and all those fancy, great automated and infrastructure and automation, et cetera, et cetera. However, seems to me that yet in this time, probably it's the middle phase, like it will evolve over to a period of time where it's going to be really simple. But right now, it seems to be like the overhead of the DevOps world is sometimes takes longer than, at least in the short term, than the benefit, the immediate benefit, if you understand what I'm saying. If I want to put, for example, Linux with an Nginx on it, it should take me, less than a minute to get it done. But now, if I want to do it through Kubernetes, now I need to go through those YAMLs and configurations and, simple stuff get more complicated. Even though you would expect this automation will save us time, we're going to work less hours. In fact, we're working many hours. And that's something.
How many hours you work is tied to other factors. I mean, if the tool makes you more productive, often you find yourself doing a lot more with the tool, as far as laws like Jevons paradox about that.
So because you enjoy it, you're using it more. So you're spending more time on the computer because you like the technology.
But if you lower the cost of resources and make them more convenient, people just use more resources. So the net work and cost goes up. Or they do Bitcoin if they're real idiots. But, so, I think there's that. But I believe that, we haven't moved the barrier to entry out of the way enough. So a lot of the benefits are day 2 benefits, operational benefits, fail or in production with larger scale systems. But for the ordinary developer, just putting, 2 Lego bricks together to make a wall for a demo or a POC or a small app, you don't need all of that stuff. So we don't have a continuous experience between the ordinary developer and the large scale application at the moment. That is a shame. I think that will get solved in time. I think we are still very early in this particular revolution or this particular phase. We haven't, for example, seen, I was saying the analogy is the 90s. If you think back to the 90s, we had WAP at the end of the 90s, which was for 5 or 6 years considered to be the future of mobile, along with things like Symbian, all of which turned out to be utterly pointless. Then we had the BlackBerry, phone with all the keys to do email. And then we had the iPhone. And suddenly everybody knew what the internet was for. The iPhone is there for music, photographs, and calls and talking to each other. And now we have all this powerful technology and we don't know what it's for. So, it could be for something that hasn't been seen yet, or it could be for an evolution of something we already use, like a kind of car thing or a home screen thing. I mean, I'm looking at you now on my desktop iMac screen from a few years ago, and I'm thinking that how long will it be before I walk into every home and there's a wall dedicated to communication, and there's all this kind of future 3D technology that Google was showing at their conference last week, which makes it seem like the person's really standing next to you.
That was awesome.
It was pretty incredible. And a combination of computers, bandwidth, connectivity, and
compression.
AI. Sorry?
Compression. That was the biggest thing.
Also, machine learning to iterate and fill in the gaps. So many different things that made it seem like a natural experience. So all of these things are becoming possible with this new platform. And eventually people will have some wow moment, and then they'll say, oh, well, I can't remember what it was like before we had, the iDog or whatever the hell it will be. Oh yeah, early days. And the developers just have to wade through the sludge in the meantime and shave the yaks.
Always shave the yaks. Usually I like to chime in a lot, but I learned so much, especially from the community stuff. And I really appreciate you coming on. I'm an early RabbitMQ user when I was at a company called Mahalo. So it was just kind of cool to see that you're like one of the creators.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would say great conversation, Alexis, but you just started talking about future and visionary. You talked about, technology in the future. I really want to have another conversation about this.
Okay.
Yeah, this seems like worth another episode. So thank you very much, Alexis, for being with us today and sharing from your experience how to build a successful open source community and open source company. Is there anything you would like to mention before we concluding?
Plug it.
Yeah, buy from Weaveworks. We sell absolutely anything you want. No, please use GitOps, first of all. It really is about making your life easier. And if you do that, then you'll find that there are things that we sell as well that will help you scale it.
We'll definitely start using GitOps. We're already in GitOps, but definitely Weaveworks tools.
Thank you very much.
Listeners, I hope you enjoyed this one. Do tune in next time. We're really excited about our lineup of guests. We have a super exciting guest next week. As well, check out the show notes for this podcast at podcast.curiefense.io. That's CURIEFENSE. Podcast.curiefense.io for the Commuting to Cloud Native podcast. Thanks again for listening. Tune in next week. Catch you later.